Welcome to SysEng Quick. My name is John, and today I'll show you how to build an Ansible inventory so that you can run plays against hosts other than the local host. I've set up a Debian test host over here in my Proxmox server, and we're going to use that to test against. Ansible typically uses SSH to connect to remote hosts, so we'll need to be able to SSH into this host in our dev container. How are we going to set that up? Well, I'm going to use an SSH key. I've already set up a key to let me log into this host. So how can we pass that into our dev container? I'm going to start by making an SSH agent. If I run ssh add-l, you'll see I don't have an agent right now. So let's do eval $ open paren ssh agent and close paren. Now we have an agent, and now we can see we have no identities in the agent. Let's add our key, ssh-add, and the path to my key is the home directory .sh/ath. And I'm going to give it the super secure password I made for this. And then if we run ssh add-l again, we can see we do have my key. Can I use this key to connect to my host? Let's find out. ssh root @ath. If I say yes, accept the key, yes, this works just fine. Okay, let's see if we can do the same thing in VS Code. Since my agent is part of my environment, if I open code from here, it will automatically place it in my VS Code environment. So I'm going to do that because it's pretty easy. So I'm in the directory I want to open in VS Code, so I'll run code dot. That's going to open VS Code over here. It's going to prompt me to reopen this in the dev container, so let's go ahead and do that. And there we go, we're in the dev container. Open up our terminal, and let's run ssh-add-l from here. Yeah, everything appears to be working okay. Can we SSH into that host? ssh root @ath doesn't know that host name. Okay, there may be an issue with resolve.conf here. Let's use the full host name. Root @ath.local.technoplaza.net. Yes, that one worked just fine. Okay, we are in our remote host. So how do we configure Ansible inventories to let us connect there using Ansible? Let's create our first Ansible inventory file. You can have multiple Ansible inventories, so I'm going to place them into a directory called inventory. And in there, we'll place our first file, which I'm going to call ath.yaml, Ansible test host. I'm using the YAML file structure for Ansible inventories in this tutorial. However, there are other formats. I simply prefer the YAML style. Many other places will show the INI style, but I like the YAML better. So let's start with that. Every host in your Ansible inventory must belong to a group. A group is simply a name for a collection of hosts in your inventory. There is a default group named all, but it's generally best practice to name your own groups and then add those hosts to that group rather than using all. So let's create a group. Every group name must conform to Ansible Python identifiers. In other words, we could name our group Debian_host. However, we can't name it Debian-host. Well, actually, you can, but Ansible will warn you about this, and it may stop working in a future version. So I highly advise you stick to alphanumeric characters and underscores in your group names. Every top-level key represents a group in your inventory. Let's call this first one simply Debian, because we have a Debian host we want to add to this inventory. To add our host, we add the host subkey. This is a dictionary comprising all of our hosts. Every key in this dictionary is the name of one of our hosts. It's usually the same as the server name. However, any valid identifier should work. Let's call it ATH. There we go. We now have our first Ansible inventory. Let's see if it works. To do this, let's run Ansible. Let's use the -i option to specify our inventory, which is inventory/ath.yaml. And then we'll run the ping module against every host in the Debian group. And let's see if that works. Unfortunately it can't. Remember, it couldn't resolve ATH before. Something with my resolve.conf isn't quite set up right. I need the full host name. There's a couple of ways we could solve this problem. We could simply change our identifier. We could say ath.local.technoplaza.net, and that would work just fine. Let's try that out. I'm still wrong. Okay, our next problem is I'm trying to connect as my user, the VS Code user. However, we need to connect as root because that's where our key is valid for. So how do we change what user it's connecting to? Well, we simply apply a variable. Any key underneath a host entry counts as a variable for that host. Let's add the Ansible _SSH _user property and add root. This will tell it to connect as root on this host. There we go. We can now connect to our remote host and ping and get a Pong response. Everything looks good so far. Remember, I told you that all group was created automatically. Can we use it? Yes, we can. And our localhost also exists, even though we didn't add that to our inventory. Localhost is always created for you automatically. I told you there was more than one way you could solve that key problem. We did fix that problem by adding our full host name. However, we could have added another property, Ansible SSH host, and we'll do ath.local.technoplaza.net and save that. Does it work now? Let's go back to our Debian. And yeah, that works just fine. We can also specify our host with the name. So the name of our host is ATH. Does that work? Yes, it does. What if we use the full host name? This doesn't match. That's because we're matching against this identifier, not this host string. If you use this, you need to use your name, not this full host name, which is why you generally use the name of your host here. Now, maybe you don't have DNS set up, and you need to figure out how to connect via IP address instead. Let me grab the IP of the host. So grab that real quick. I think it's 165. Yeah, that looks right. Okay, we can change this and say it is this IP instead. Does this work? It's going to prompt us to accept the key because we haven't done this before, but this should work. Yes. So that's how we make our Ansible inventory. Hosts can belong to multiple groups at the same time. We've already seen that with the implicit all group. Remember, this host is a member of the Debian group and the all group. Can it be a member of other custom groups we make? Yes, it can. This Debian host is actually an LXC container. Let's make a new group called LXC hosts. And then we'll add the host in here, and we'll say ath.local.technoplaza.net. Let's go ahead and save this, and let's see if that works. We'll go ahead and run this against LXC. And yes, it worked, even though I didn't add this key down here. How did that work? Well, all hosts and groups get merged in your inventory. If any variable applies to a host, it applies to a host in every group. Remember, this is simply a grouping of hosts. The hosts are what counts in the inventory. Everything gets applied to a host somehow. It's just how you structure that so that they apply most efficiently. You can actually apply variables to a group of hosts, but they will become a variable on every host. Let's see how we could do that. We will go and dedent over here, and after our host key, we'll have a vars key. And let's go dedent this. And now all of these vars in the Debian group applies to every host inside the Debian group. Let's see if that works. Can we ping our Debian host group? Yeah, that looks fine. What about LXC? Did that group var get applied? Yes, it did. Remember, all variables are applied to hosts, not to groups. Groups are simply a collection of hosts. If there's a host here and a host here, any variable that gets applied in one group gets applied to the host in that group. and that means it still works over here. If you want to apply group variables to multiple groups, it can be helpful to nest those groups. Let's see how that might work out. Let's say that the LXC group is a child of the Debian group. To do that, we'll add a new property called children, and we're going to move the LXC group underneath the children key. Let's go ahead and indent that properly. And now we can remove this host from the Debian group. Doing this, now this host is a member of the LXC group and the Debian group. Let's see if that still works. Let's ping LXC. Yep, looks good. Let's ping Debian. Again, it still works. So nothing's really changed here. But what if there were hosts that are in a different group that do not overlap? What if we had another group, say VMs, and in here I had a host called vm.localplaza.net. Now, because this wasn't in the same place, if we had that down here in this group outside of this children, these vars would not be applied, because the only reason this group var gets applied is because we merged the host. If this host were not under this group, it wouldn't apply. So that is one use case for nesting groups in your inventory. So now that we have an inventory file, how do we apply this to a playbook? Well, let's make a new playbook. I'd like to install NeoFetch on the Linux container. So can we do that? Well, we should be able to. Let's make a new play. We're going to name it install NeoFetch. And we will target some hosts. We have been doing localhost, but that's no longer correct. We want to target our LXC containers. So this host field is similar to what we put on the command line when we used LXC or Debian or all. So we can put a group name here and it should work just fine. Let's go ahead and just say Debian. Now we'll say gather facts. Again, we don't need to do that, so I'll put false for that. And then we'll list some of our tasks. Okay, our first task will be to install NeoFetch. And we're going to use the Ansible built-in .apt package module to do that. So we're going to do the name as NeoFetch. The state is going to be present, meaning we want this package to be present on the system. And we're going to say we do want to update the cache. I just installed the system and it probably needs the cache updated. So let's go ahead and save that and let's see if it works. We'll go to the command line and run Ansible-playbook-i inventory/ath. This is our inventory file. And then we'll specify our playbook, which in this case is neofetch.yml. Let's see if this works. It's doing something. It may take a minute to get this, but it should work shortly. There we go. It said changed 1. That means it should have installed NeoFetch. Let's see if it actually did. We could do ssh root at ath-local-technoplaza.net, and can we run NeoFetch now? Yes, we can. Everything looks good now. There is one more thing that's kind of handy when you're using the command line with an inventory, the shell module. Let's see how that works. If we do Ansible-i inventory ath, specifying the shell module, and then we need to pass some arguments. We need to give it the -a flag to pass arguments. We're going to do NeoFetch in our arguments, and we need to target our host, so let's go with LXC. And there we go. We ran NeoFetch with Ansible from the command line with our inventory. And that's the basics of using Ansible inventories on the command line and with playbooks. I hope this has been helpful. If so, I'd appreciate it if you hit those like and subscribe buttons. It really helps the channel out. Come back and see us next time. We will do more Ansible work. Thanks for watching. See you then.